Hello, my friends, wherever you may find yourself in time and space. Welcome to Making Sense of. Today, I have a special guest with me, Tegan Kline from Edge and Node, to talk about everything Web3. You may have heard this term Web3 bandied about. Maybe you've heard about NFTs or DAOs or DeFi or game. I don't even know what it is anymore. This thing called Web3, decentralized web, is become a thing that everyone talks about. And who better to talk about it than someone who actually works in the industry in a central location where things are actually happening? So, can you just tell us briefly who you are?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm Tegan Kline. I'm a co-founder of Edge and Node, and we are one of the now many core development teams within the Graph ecosystem. And the Graph is a decentralized indexing and query protocol. So kind of doing similar to what Google does in organizing the world's data in a centralized way, but us doing it kind of in a decentralized way for all on-chain blockchain data within the Web3 space. Yeah.
That's as a developer, I'm always like, ooh, an API.
Yes,
so,
open
so,
API.
so the graph is related to GraphQL somehow, right?
Yeah, so subgraphs exist within the graph ecosystem. It's permissionless, so anyone can create a subgraph, which is an open API, and you use GraphQL. It is using GraphQL, and it's
Right.
based in WASM.
I'm just trying to
Mhm.
connect the dots so people actually understand. So
Yeah.
it's basically like a web interface layer to the blockchain in trying to coordinate information so that it can travel.
Exactly. And so many of these applications, just like applications that exist on your smartphone, they are existing in a decentralized way, and many of them use subgraphs. And
Mhm.
we've seen so much innovation just because the data is now like open and transparent instead of kind of being behind walled gardens like what we see a lot in Web 2.
Right. So the obvious first question is, can you define what this Web3 is for us?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for me, Web3 has a very specific definition, and that is a brand new platform for fully decentralized applications to live. And in order to have Web3, which we haven't achieved Web3 yet because there are still centralized points of failure within a lot of this technology. But in order to have that, it needs to be truly decentralized, permissionless, trustless, and open source. And the reason for that is so that we give all of the power, decision making, control, and ownership back to the users of this technology, of these applications. And this is kind of like a stark difference from what we've seen with Web 2. And so just kind of learning some of the lessons with Web 2, bringing those into Web 3, just to kind of make it a more fair and kind of like bringing freedom to individuals.
Right. So how does the blockchain fit into this?
Yeah, so the blockchain is kind of like that bottom layer of the stack. So you have layer 1 blockchains like Ethereum as an example. You also have layer 2 blockchains because we're seeing kind of scaling challenges with Ethereum. We've seen a lot of layer 2 blockchains like Optimism, ZK Sync, Starkware, Arbitrum all come out with solutions. And what's great about these solutions is they actually pull the security of Ethereum without the added costs of like Ethereum gas costs. So you could build on Ethereum, you can build on a layer 2, or you can build on both. And so we're actually seeing a lot of that where applications will build on multiple chains, but it kind of fractionalizes the developer experience, the user experience. But all of this is kind of being solidified and changing. But then you also have the middleware layer, which is where the graph fits in. And you also
Mhm.
have the storage layer. So decentralizing the storage layer, you have protocols like Arweave and IPFS. And this is really like a core component when it comes to NFTs. And with Arweave, you pay once and it's stored forever, which you might not want that for everything. But there are certain things like when it comes to misinformation, you might want to secure that on Arweave so that it does live forever and there's no way to kind of reinvent the truth around something.
Right. Because this is really about decentralization. This is the core idea is decentralization of information, as opposed to these, as opposed to the centralization that we currently have. I have
Yeah.
to be careful about my language here, because yeah, but so I guess one of the things that people find confusing about this term Web3, as in WEB3, no space, no .o afterwards,
Mhm.
is that there's this there's this, it seems like an umbrella term that mainly centers around all these financial instruments that exist here. So NFTs, DAOs, like all of those types of things. And that these two conversations often get overlapped, especially when people talk about them in the media. And to me, there is a enormous difference between talking about Bitcoin and Ethereum as currencies and decentralization of the web as a concept. Those two things do not overlap in my head
Mm.
in a natural way.
Yeah, so in my opinion, so there was this phase where people said like blockchains not Bitcoin or blockchains not tokens. And to me that's not very interesting because we've had federated databases for over 30 years and oftentimes what happens is it kind of does reduce down to like a central point of control and failure. With the advent of tokens, like Bitcoin, like Ethereum, you can now have like open source sustainable technology in a decentralized way without needing to ask for donations, whereas previously it kind of the success of it depends on people contributing and to kind of receiving donations. And now with tokens, like it's a very powerful way to organize a community to compensate people fairly for the value that they bring. And with Bitcoin and Ethereum and the graph, there is no central point that's collecting fees or taking out like revenue that should go peer to peer. So imagine like Uber, instead of like Uber collecting a ton of money for that ride, you as the passenger give it directly to the driver. And that's what these protocols are enabling. And so
Mhm.
with these tokens, it allows for much more participation. And it also allows for individuals to be rewarded for early use of platforms. Whereas like TikTok or Twitter, the early users, even though TikTok and Twitter are nothing without their users, the early participants didn't receive anything for being early to
Mhm.
TikTok and Twitter. Whereas in Web3, what you're seeing is like decentralized exchanges like Uniswap allocating tokens to early participants. And you can be a liquidity provider and you can earn for providing that service. You've also seen this with ENS. So ENS rewarded its decentralized domains. So you can actually own your domain. And you can kind of send Ethereum directly from me to you via that domain.
Mhm.
And they rewarded the early participants or the early users of ENS. And so I think that the tokens are a crucial component in Web3. But the problem is a lot of tokens, like a lot of tokens don't have a lot of thought put around them. And it's really crucial to get the revenue right. The revenue just needs to go peer to peer in that token economy. I think Bitcoin did a great job of this. Ethereum did a great job of this. The graph is a utility work token. Like a lot of thought went into the incentive structures around each of these tokens. And
Mhm.
it's a mechanism that's needed to use the protocols. Whereas you'll see a lot of tokens are just there to like make money. Or I think there's also tokens where it's around governance and governance hasn't been solved for yet. Like a lot of people have tokens, but then they don't vote with those tokens, which is the whole purpose of like a governance token, not for like
It's
number go up.
almost like real life where people have the ability to vote and they just don't.
Right.
Shocking. I'm so surprised that this is happening.
Right. Yeah. And so we're kind of solving for those kind of important components within governance, right? And with decentralized autonomous organizations, there's still governance challenges, right? Because I
Mhm.
don't want to vote on every single issue. I want to delegate my votes to someone who's maybe more knowledgeable on that. So, yeah.
Yeah. It, an important distinction to make here, because when we talk about crypto as a thing, right? People often think of like you have Bitcoin and Ethereum or Ether, which are it's like made up money, right? It's money that exists in this digital chain, like any bank can just issue their own currency. That's basically what it is, right? It's money. But then you have this thing called token. And when you're talking about this, you're saying like token can be a voting token, or it can be an asset token, or it can be some other thing. So can you just define like how do you differentiate between a coin and a token?
So I would say they're very similar. So Ethereum, you need Ethereum to access the Ethereum blockchain. When you use these applications on Ethereum, you generally need to pay gas to the miners who are providing the service for you. Ethereum is moving from proof of work to proof of stake. And so then like the individuals that are then like involved in that staking ecosystem will be the ones that are compensated. And similar with Bitcoin. So you use Bitcoin, the miners get paid for that because it's proof of work. So there are, I would say what you need to look for when looking at like tokens or currencies, cryptocurrencies or coins, you want to look at their incentive structures. We call it token economics within the space, and ensure that it's actually needed, like that token actually serves like a utility in these networks, and sometimes it doesn't. And so there's like diligence that you need to do when looking at the space and getting involved in the space. And I always recommend that everyone should use everything that they're getting involved in before like going on an exchange and putting money into something, because sometimes they're marketed but there's no usage behind any of those tokens other than like for a number to go up. So you have to be very careful in the space.
Right. This is where the whole NFT hype comes in, right? They have
A lot of
I've
speculation.
noticed there's a lot of interesting different types of things that are happening with NFTs, where you have some that are just like buy art. And then you have some that are buy this art, and eventually the money raised from selling this art will turn into something else. And then you have some that are like buy this thing which actually exists in a game or exists in some other space. And I think people have a really hard time understanding like, how do you know? How do you know what you're buying here? And how do you know? Because we're both on TikTok, and we both see all these Web3 influencers being like, buy more tokens, invest all your money, take your life savings and your student loans and sink them into this particular NFT project. And then a bunch of other people are going, do your research before you, right? And for anyone standing on the outside, you then wonder, what constitutes research here? How do you know what is a scam and what is genuine in this environment?
Yeah, and I think that this is where like of going to events and actually seeing like what's happening, who's using what, if what's even being used, understanding the ecosystems around and the communities around these NFTs. And each NFT is also a token. It's just a non-fungible token. So it can't be traded one for one. Like one NFT does not equate to another NFT, whereas like one Ethereum equals one Ethereum, which is a fungible token. But with NFTs, I would say 99%, and similar to tokens, like 99% of those are not going to exist in 5 to 10 years. And also within the NFT space, we've seen a ton of speculation. And this happens with any new technological advancement. I mean, look at like the dot-com bubble. Most of that is not around today, but guess what? The web was created from that bubble. And so you have this small percentage that does make a big impact on the world. And that's kind of how I view all of these different bubbles. So there was the DeFi bubble. And then what happens is like the bubble comes and then it goes down because the infrastructure isn't ready. And then it comes back like 10 times stronger. And we saw that with NFTs as well, like this little bubble. The infrastructure was not ready. It's still not ready, in my opinion. And then it kind of came back 10 times stronger, and now it's kind of flushing out. And so with NFT space, you do have to be very careful. What I find interesting is beyond just like the art is the access that it can get you. So like with CryptoPunks as an example, it's like more of an OG NFT. It was created a long time ago, one of the first NFTs, but you're seeing a lot of like OGs in the space getting involved in CryptoPunks. So then you as a CryptoPunk holder, you get access to this community of OG individuals that are kind of similar and like-minded, which is what I find more interesting, right? Is like that it gets me access to like network and meet new people.
So it's a club membership.
Yeah, but
very much so. I mean, some of these things are actually called clubs.
Totally. Yeah.
So let's switch gears here for a second, because your backstory is interesting, both because it's interesting, but also because it's a good representation of what I'm seeing a lot of. Like, I see a lot of people enter the same kind of path that you went down. So can you tell us a bit about how you ended up here in Web3?
Yeah, absolutely. So I learned about Bitcoin in 2011 from a friend who actually launched Avalanche Protocol, which is another layer one. And I think I tried to buy it at the time. It was really difficult back then. You had to like meet up with someone in person and like exchange cash for Bitcoin, or you had to like send your money overseas and hope that you got Bitcoin into your account. And so I went this traditional Wall Street path. I went to investment banking at Bank of America and then moved over to sales and trading at Barclays. So in banking, working like 100 hours a week as an analyst, you're like the lowest on the totem pole. You spend time like it's 2 a.m. You're like fixing PowerPoints, like the periods on a PowerPoint, like, and you're paid the least, right? And you work the most, which I think
Super
like
rewarding work.
you're right, yeah. And also just like having this knowledge, I think allowed me to really see Ethereum when I did learn about it in 2016, because there are these like middlemen or these gatekeepers, and they add like unnecessary friction. They take a ton of the cost. And I think with Ethereum, that's really when like the light bulb moment went off for me in 2016, was because I saw this opportunity to create a new internet, to create a new financial system. And now we're starting to do that today. But like I said, it's still so early in the space. We're inventing things every day, right? Web3 is not, in my mind, Web3 is the future of the internet, but it's not yet proven. And that's why there's like still so much opportunity now today. But you do have to be very careful, because, you know, a lot of the founders that I work with are in it for like the right reasons, and they want to make an impact on the world. And they really like taking to heart the values of Bitcoin, Ethereum into the work that they're doing, but not everyone is that way. So it is important to kind of do the diligence within the space. But yeah, I started from kind of this traditional Wall Street path and then found my way into crypto, and I really found my passion within there. I was never passionate about finance. I was kind of always volunteering, spending like thousands of hours volunteering, because I kind of felt guilty being in finance for 6 years. And I was grateful to kind of find my passion within Web3 and the crypto space when I did.
Right. Your story reminds me of the open source story in many ways, that a lot of people gravitate towards open source because of the community aspect, and because you feel like you're contributing into something that is bigger than just making money for some person higher up in the building who's just sitting there gilding his couch with diamonds or whatever. So it's,
Absolutely.
but I'm seeing a lot of people like, it doesn't actually mean that there are a lot of people doing this, but I'm seeing a lot of people talk about how they're moving from finance into crypto, right? And you're seeing, you know, news stories all the time about how these big assets managers are starting to invest in crypto, which to me is interesting, because the whole selling point of this Web3 idea is to take power away from the people that are currently sinking enormous amounts of money into the same space. And a lot of the founders that are building in the Web3 space are being financed by the same people who are financing and even owning the things that they're trying to take power away from, which, you know, opens the door to some questions about how can you take power away from someone who's actively investing in your thing?
Yeah, so it is a great question. I think this is where you have to look at, what are they investing into? Are they investing into equity? If so, there might be a problem there, because what do you want from equity? You want fees, you want SaaS, you want ads, you want to close the data off. Whereas if they're buying into tokens, or like they call them SAFs, which is like a future token offering.
Mhm.
And so if they're investing into the token side of things, and the tokens, so within the graph as an example, even if you have a ton of GRT tokens, if you're not providing a service within the graph network, it doesn't matter. And so even the indexers that have a ton of GRT tokens, which are the node operators, if they're not providing queries quickly and efficiently, they're not going to be served as many queries. And so having a bunch of tokens doesn't necessarily mean like centralization. It really kind of depends on like the token economics of each kind of different protocol. But I do think like you raise a good point, because there are founders that like they don't know which direction they're going, and they end up selling equity, and they want to do good for the world, but then they're kind of locked into this like structure that they can't get out of. I think Reddit is is a good example of that within like the Web2 space, because I think Reddit shares very similar values to Web3, but now they're kind of being forced on this IPO path, whereas like they have similar values, but where do you go? And so I think tokens are kind of like the next evolution of the business model. But I would love to kind of hear your perspective too on this. And you shared some like good insight from the open source and how it was kind of corrupted by some of these powers that be that want to kind of keep that control. And when it comes to like policy making, so I would love to kind of learn from you, and your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think to make a short version of it, when the open source space really exploded in the early like 2000s, it was very much just people wanting to build tools for themselves and then share those tools with their friends to do the same thing that the Web3 community is talking about, which is give people the tools to have agency on the web, right? Take control over your message on the web and spread it out. And that's how we got all these blogging platforms, right? You used to have some centralized platforms like Blogger, but that quickly evolved into WordPress, which was entirely open source. You download it, install it on whatever server you want, serve it up, and then, but then over time, and it was all volunteer contributor based, right? No one was getting paid for this work. Everyone was just contributing into it, building, extending the tools, and open source licenses allowed for that. Then over time, what happens is when you build something that is popular, all of a sudden it's worth something. It has monetary value, right? And it has power. So then just saying that you work with this thing in itself starts getting power. So some people who were centrally placed within these projects, usually the founders of the project, built companies to support the project. Those companies now have billion-dollar valuations. And there's this whole debate within the open source community around how you have a company with $1 billion valuation that has employees that volunteer their time full time into the project. And then you have volunteer contributors who get paid nothing. And the company's value rests entirely on the contributions of the volunteers who are not paid. And when the volunteer contributors stand up and say, how come I don't get paid, but you have millions of dollars? The answer is always, well, everyone is a volunteer contributor. And it's like, that is a very interesting lie that you're telling. And it's concerning that you think it's true, but that's what it is. And what we saw was as things became more powerful, people started consolidating power. And what I'm concerned about with the way that this Web3 concept is evolving is I'm seeing the same tendency already. The difference is it's front loading the money part. So the money part is happening before anything is built, and by that I mean you actually see people say you need to buy into whatever project or something early on to get voting tokens so that you have power, which means you're literally saying this is not about building the technology. It's about hoarding power before it gets built. So by the time it gets built, you take control, right? Which is runs against a lot of the ideology. And I think there's a conflict here between the ideology of like this super free market laissez-faire economy type argument that the Bitcoiners have, and this idea of open decentralized web that gives power to everyone. And I remember I posted something on TikTok about this, and then you responded to it. And you made this distinction between, what was it? Bitcoin, you had a term. It was like Bitcoin maximizers versus the Ethereum community. Like, can you explain this to me?
Totally. Yeah. So within crypto, within Web3, there are all these different personality types. And so the Bitcoiners tend to be like the Bitcoin maximalists, which means they only see Bitcoin. They don't believe in Ethereum. They don't believe in anything else. They don't believe in Web3. They're generally more like monetary policy minded individuals. So, and this, their thesis, I mean, it's kind of being proven right with what we've seen within the world today, like the US dollar being seized, money printing, all of that is kind of like inflating the dollar away or allowing the dollar to lose purchasing power, making the dollar like no longer like this risk-free asset, right? Like if the US can seize that, it's not risk-free. And so that monetary policy piece is generally what those Bitcoiners see. And within the Web3 space, which encompasses many different protocols, there's actually an image on that Edge and Node blog, which includes many of the different protocols building within the Web3 space.
This what you mean?
This image. Yeah. So these are many different protocols within the Web3 space. So you have Ethereum on the layer one side, Ethereum, Solana, Near, Cosmos, Polkadot, but each of those protocols has their own community, and each one is different than the other. But in the Web3 space, it's more like the Bitcoiners tend to be more libertarian, whereas within the Web3 space, it's more like socialist or meritocratic. Like UBI is a common theme among Ethereum, and the Bitcoiners tend to be like more rugged because like imagine being a Bitcoiner back in 2009 or 2010. Like it was a scary time because you didn't know, like you didn't know that now, over 33% of institutions are holding digital assets. Like back then it could have been deemed illegal. But then you have the community of Ethereum, and it's like rainbows and butterflies. And so it's just like a very stark difference. And I kind of relate more to the Ethereum community and ecosystem, but I definitely have like that Bitcoiner in me, and I'm kind of this hybrid between the two.
Right. So the see, you had another graphic here that I wanted to bring up. Just scrolling through my interface.
Yeah.
There we go. So this is this story that gets told. The Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. So can you just take me through this graph?
Yeah, absolutely. So Web 1 was back in like it started in 1991 or so. And this was kind of where there was a high barrier to entry when it comes to like building and developing on this web. And then we kind of moved into Web 2, where there is less of a barrier to entry. This creator economy kind of began. And this is really where we are today, where you use like TikTok and Instagram and Airbnb and Uber. But the problem with Web 2, and I'm grateful for Web 2, I'm grateful for the internet, it's given us so much. But one of the problems is like this monetization piece. And so like Google started out with really great intentions, in my opinion, but they had to learn how to monetize, and they're making now billions of dollars on selling advertisements. And so to sell advertisements, you need to lock your users in, you need to gatekeep their data, so not share their data with anyone, so that you can identify trends of these individuals, sell advertisements to companies, and then sell products to individuals. And so this, in my opinion, isn't what the internet was created for, right? Like this, but incentives are everything. And that's what the internet is incentivized to do. And so Web3 is breaking that open and allowing for like all of that power and control that like Uber and Google and Twitter have, right? Where you can be deplatformed, they just dictate which content you share. All of that is kind of given back to the individual. And in Web3, your identity will be portable. So Facebook doesn't dictate your identity. Facebook can't just turn off your profile or cancel you. I shouldn't say cancel. I feel like that's a triggering word these days. But remove you from the platform or remove your content from the platform. And so in Web3, these protocols that are shown here are protocols within that Web3 stack. And Web 2 is really about platforms. So each of these images here are platforms. Web 3 has one platform. It is Web 3. That's the platform we trust. But then there's no other platforms on top of there. And it's really important that there aren't like platforms on top of there, because at the platform level is where that control, that power kind of centralizes. And we want to decentralize all of that within Web 3. And so that stack is being solidified. All of those protocols are starting to talk to each other. And once that is solidified, you'll see brand new use cases beyond DeFi, beyond NFTs, beyond DAOs, beyond anything we can even imagine today on Web3. The danger is what we're seeing today is venture capitalists are calling platforms Web3. And those platforms are not Web3. I call them like Web 2.3, just kind of poking a little fun. But we need to make sure that Web3 isn't corrupted by people that want to like retain the power and control and money, and kind of give that back to the individuals.
Right, because you're seeing some very interesting geopolitical issues happening right now around crypto in particular, and it's surfacing some of these issues. So because of the war in Ukraine, there was a call for like the Ukrainian government called for a bunch of Russian Bitcoin wallets to be blocked. And then the company that held those wallets, like the wallet company, said, absolutely under no circumstances are we going to do that. Then OpenSea separately blocked access to a bunch of things, and then people are like, but it's supposed to be decentralized. How can this one company just block access to it? We had the same thing in Canada with the occupation of Ottawa, where the Canadian government was like putting a tag on some wallets to try to figure out what's going on. And within this, there's this really sticky problem of, while it's problematic that a company can block access to things, it's also an important tool, both for law enforcement and for like geopolitical issues. Like you can imagine a future in which let's say like a thought experiment, Bitcoin is the universal currency. Like there's one universal currency, and a country goes to war in another country, and then the international community says that, the most non-violent thing we can do is just block that country off, their economy off. But you can't do that anymore because you now have this decentralized economy, so it's impossible to do that. So now you took away the only real functional sanction tool that the international community has. That doesn't seem to me like a great idea. That seems to me like a very, very, very clear path to like nuclear war, right?
So interesting.
So it's one of those things where I feel like at times when I look at this stuff, it feels extremely half-baked. Like it's considering everything is rainbows and roses and everything is fine, but then humans are complicated. Oh no, well, the only thing that matters is freedom, right? So I understand the ideology and I understand the intent. I don't understand the application, because it seems not to link up with how the world actually works.
But I think we should be questioning how the world actually works. Like, should any government leader be able to like cause a nuclear war? Like, isn't your job to protect your people? And so I do think like certain things do need to be questioned. I also don't know if like the people of a country should be the ones that suffer and like, yeah, that suffer because they're of their world leader. So it is tricky, like, but I do think like people need access to capital and people should be able to have ownership over their capital. And I don't necessarily think like a government should be able to cut off something that is yours. But I do think there are other ways to like enforce law. I think it is important to like enforce the law and make sure people aren't harming other people. But even with decentralization, like the node operators, they have to operate within like their local laws and jurisdictions. And then with like OpenSea, I would consider OpenSea as a platform. It's similar to Coinbase. I think it's an important bridge from like Web2 or like the centralized world to the decentralized world. But I also think it's important for people that are using those platforms to know these are centralized. And a lot of money is like a lot of crypto is held on exchanges, centralized exchanges. Andreas Antonopoulos has like the famous line of like, not your keys, not your crypto, not your keys, not your Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just important to kind of educate around that. But I do think it's also important to make sure people aren't harming each other and breaking the law with what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's just a very interesting. There's a lot of interesting. Like when you come into new technologies, you often discover the edges of things by introducing a new technology. Like when you work with, let's say, GraphQL, right? If you work with GraphQL and you slap a GraphQL layer on top of any API, you immediately see where the edges of that API sits. But you wouldn't have known that unless you put GraphQL on top of it. And I feel like in some cases, this conversation around decentralization in the Web3 version of decentralization and blockchain-based currencies shows exposes the edges of our current systems in a way that we haven't done before, and opens conversations around that, which are just really interesting. So I was thinking about this, understanding, because you're saying there are no platforms. So instead, what you have is a wallet, right? Where you say your wallet is your identity, and then you use your wallet to gain access to different services. So what that actually looks like? Like, if we had something like a chat app, what does that look like in this Web3 environment where there is no central control?
Yeah, so it's still kind of being figured out, right? We haven't seen like the social media killer application within Web3 yet, but how I envision it is, and we talked about like canceling, I think like moderation is important. right, in Web3 as well. But I think it's important that it's like an opt-in situation. And so what I want to see is like a moderation protocol where maybe you have different tiers of moderation and you can opt in to different levels of moderation. So say if I only want to see specific content, or maybe I only want to see like rainbows and butterflies and nothing else, I can opt into that type of moderation. And I think it should be a toggle where it's like, maybe one day I might get curious on what's on the other side of that. And I can like toggle it to the other side. And maybe you can have like different groups of people that you have similar ideologies with, or and you could kind of opt into their moderation policies. That's kind of how I envision, because social media and like that piece.
How does it actually work? Right? Because right now, the way it works is you log into a platform and the platform controls your access. But in this Web3 environment where the platform doesn't exist, you would then have to have somehow the system still needs to work, and there still needs to be a way of sending messages, and there has to be a cohesive timeline of what is happening. Right?
Yeah, so you can look at an example called Orbis, and they're using, I believe it's Ethereum, Ceramic, and Arweave right now. They will be using the graph once the graph supports all of those different protocols. But the problem that they're seeing is like the need for reputation and for moderation on that like social media Web3 application. And so we're still kind of figuring that piece out. But I think like, I guess you do have to be a little bit optimistic within the Web3 space. I guess with Moxie's post, it was very like, these are all the issues. And I agree with those issues. And we've been shouting about those issues for a really long time. But where we differ is like, I think we will overcome these challenges and get to the other side in a better place. At least I hope, if we are successful in kind of removing all of that power and control.
Yeah, it just amuses me. It's like everything that happens in Web3, all the conversations are happening in centralized platforms.
I know.
And I'm like, you can't say you're going to change everything if you can't even build a platform to have a conversation about it. That's like the first place to start. But you brought up something.
Yeah, 6 months. 6 months to a year, I think we'll be there.
That there will be a Web3 Discord.
Yes,
that's like the bleeding ulcer of the whole conversation, right? It's like, let's talk about decentralizing the web on Discord.
But the other thing is like, okay, so with like these tech stacks, like I mean, your notifications are probably insane across all of these different platforms. And these platforms basically do the same thing, but with like a little tweak of something different. And I think like with Web3, you have like the protocol stack, and then it's a public good, right? All those protocols are public goods. You don't need to rebuild this in a centralized way across all of these different, like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, like all of that is centralized, like dev resources. And if those companies go away, those dev resources are gone. Whereas in Web3, it's the protocols. And then the only thing like centralized is that user experience. And so they're all kind of using those same protocols. And so hopefully it's like a less fragmented user experience on Web3.
So Larry has a question here. Would you include projects like Solid and Blue Sky in your concept of Web3? Both of them seem relevant to decentralized social media.
Yeah, so Blue Sky is kind of Twitter's use case for kind of decentralizing Twitter. For me, it's kind of using like an old tech stack. I think Jack of Twitter is like he's a Bitcoiner, right? He doesn't really see Web3. He's a monetary policy guy. And so I don't agree with like the tech stack that they are building on. I don't think that will be the tech stack used within Web3, but I think it's great that they are attempting that, and it'll be a great, we'll see. I guess we'll see. But I wouldn't include that in like the definition of Web3.
Right. But he brings up an important point, which is decentralization is something that exists with or without this blockchain-based Web3 concept. Like Tim Berners-Lee runs Solid through Inrupt, which is decentralization protocol that exists irrespective of a blockchain. And for a lot of people who have been working with like on the web platform for decades, it feels like a lot of people in Web3 are not fully aware of how difficult decentralization is and why we don't already have it. Because the work of trying to decentralize the web has been happening for 20 years, right? And it's not like, let's slap blockchain on top of it and suddenly that problem is solved. It's more like, let's slap blockchain on top of it and add additional complications to it. So I think, I see, I spend a lot of time on TikTok to research how people talk about things. And one of the things I see a lot of is people that are are coming into the Web3 space, starting to do an us versus them type of thing, where they say like, they are trying to prevent us from taking power that is rightfully ours, or they are stuck in the past and this is a paradigm shift and everything is going to be different. And a lot of us are like, no, we just understand how the web infrastructure works, and this doesn't work the way you're saying it does. And it's like, the Web3, that web is built on top of the HTTP protocol. And if you want to do this ENS thing, you have to change the governing protocol of the entire internet. And it's not just the web, it's the entire internet. The thing that we're doing right now, this video chat thing, doesn't work in a decentralized environment. It needs a centralized server, because otherwise you have to shard up the video and then spread it across a multiple, like there are things that happen on the web that just cannot be done in a decentralized way, in spite of how much you try.
I don't necessarily agree with that. So you can look into like Live Peer, which is decentralized streaming. I would check that out. I do think like I would love to join forces together, and like we know building decentralized is hard. It's like a challenge we've been working on for like within the graph like for over 4 years. But I think like we're kind of overcoming this, and I do think like the tokens are a crucial component to this, and that is something that's new. That's a new component to add to all of this. But I think like we should work more closely together, like the us and the them. Within this space, because I do think we share similar values. We're like pioneering, we're like pushing this space forward. And if we are wrong about Web3, like as long as we get to decentralization and we kind of get like that vision back to the users, to the individuals, I think like we win. And so I think we should work together because we share like similar ideals around all of this.
Yeah. The one thing that it struck me a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference that was hilariously called the Web 3.1 conference. It's like thinking about, okay, so what if Web3 exists? What next, right? It's going like, let's assume Web3, what happens after that, right? Which is a good thought experiment. Listening to a lot of the conversations, I realized that a lot of the critique that is coming towards what we call Web 2.0 is actually not a critique of Web 2.0. It's specifically a critique of surveillance capitalism, which is it's like a business model built on top of Web 2.0. But it's like, from a technical perspective, those two things are not connected. They are just like, Web 2.0 is a platform like this purported Web 3 is. Surveillance capitalism is something that is hovering above the platform and sucking data out of it. And I don't see a way for the decentralized web, the way it's being proposed under Web3, to avoid that surveillance capitalism layer. And I'll tell you why. Because you have the pseudonymity thing, right? Where you have a wallet that ostensibly can be anonymous. Like, you can choose to create a wallet that isn't connected to you in any way. But if you use that wallet over time and people just monitor how it's transacting on the blockchain, you will eventually be able to figure out who you are, right? And in an environment where everyone is using wallets all the time, a store will be able to figure out who you are based on the data they have. So this idea that we can have
anonymity. Yeah.
Thank you. ESL. I should tattoo that on my face so that people understand my English isn't as good as it sounds. The idea that we can have anonymity with the blockchain seems to not be true when we scale it up. And in that scenario, once you are able to run, analysis, chain analysis, which you can already do, you can do the same surveillance capitalism on top of this platform. It's just that the surveillance capitalism is no longer exposing you to ads. It's far more insidious than that. It would be like exposing you to things when you go into spaces, right? So when you go into a store, all of a sudden they know everything about you.
So I think that is a very dystopian future. There are ways to kind of circumvent like that tracking. So right now you can use like Tornado Cash. There's also like tokens that are privacy tokens like Zcash and Monero. I think the mere fact that they are so private is kind of like an issue because, and we haven't seen them take off in the way that I would have expected them to, because you can't check certain things within like the supply and within the chains. But there's also zero knowledge that's being worked on and kind of included within the crypto space. It's not yet there, but I do think we will be able to get privacy within the blockchain space. And I think like data that is meant to be private should be private. You should be able to verify that data without needing to see everything. Like, do you really need all my credit card number, like all of that information when you like take my when I pay for something? Like, no, you don't. And if there's a way to obfuscate that so you can just check that the information is correct without needing to know what the information is, I think that's a really powerful tool. A lot of the innovation we've seen in the Web3 space so far is because of the transparency around like public data. And I think like that is, it's exciting to see like the speed at which people can innovate when they have the tools. Whereas in like Web2, I can't port LinkedIn data to my own application, or I can't port LinkedIn data to Crunchbase because like the APIs are closed. But in Web3, like all the APIs are open. So like Uniswap uses a subgraph, the APIs are open. And then you saw like a ton of innovation because of that data. And even centralized companies like Coinbase, Mazari, CMC, they leverage that data because it's the best, like the fastest way to get on-chain data in real time. And so what I'm interested to see, I think like we will solve privacy, but then what I'm interested to see is like, will people want to keep everything private and then stifle that innovation? Or will people be okay kind of sharing some of that data so that can be public?
Right. And this is that whole tokenomics thing, that in this environment, everything becomes a tradable asset. So all your information, like you're basically saying, instead of some nebulous multinational corporation take like hoovering up my information and selling it, I get to control who buys my information, which then brings up this, which brings up this inequity question of like, so does that mean that, for instance, people in the global south, the only way they can buy into the system is by selling their data because they may not have access to as many funds, which creates a huge inequity problem within the society where rich people can, just like now, like I have YouTube Premium because I can afford it to avoid exposing my child to ads all the time. But that's a privilege I have because I happen to have enough money or have enough liquid funds to be able to pay for something as frivolous as YouTube Premium, right? But not everyone has that privilege. And in this tokenomics or token economy, it feels to me like there's path to a type of exploitation that we don't really see now that could end up harming the people it's trying to help.
Potentially, but I think like the opportunity is there for a lot of people that previously didn't have that opportunity. Granted, like you still need Wi-Fi connection and like a computer or smartphone, but I think like that's miles beyond where we were before. And the thing about this space is you do get compensated commensurate to the value that you bring. And so people are playing video games in like third world countries and making more money than like their family has made in an entire generation because of like the play to earn stuff that's happening. Also like people within the graph, like there were different curators that like got a life-changing amount of money by participating in the curator program, or indexers that previously like were left out of the financial system now able to like run nodes as an individual and make a lot of money, you know, for where they are. And I think like the opportunity is there. It's just our job to like bring that opportunity to everyone. And like I come from a very small town in Ohio. There were people in my class, like kids in my class that were brilliant and like they didn't have the same opportunity or the same support. And, you know, even though they wanted to like go out and pursue their dreams, they weren't able to, right? And they had to go and like provide for their family and enter the workforce or have kids. And I think like with this technology, what I'm hoping for is that we can kind of bring this opportunity to everyone across the globe so that they're no longer in like this survival mode of just being able to make enough money to like feed themselves and their family, but they're able to kind of go beyond that and like find their purpose. And I think if we stop collecting the money at like these centralized companies and start like sharing with the people that are contributing the work, we can actually make a difference in the world and kind of get people, closer to their passions.
Yeah, I just want to show people this because I think it's very funny.
Sincerely say that you love the job you're doing. Just be ready to serve.
Be quiet, phone. What is happening? It's like Canadian Armed Forces running ads
Oh my
with
God.
all women in them because it's International Women's Day. on TikTok. First thing I see when I go to TikTok. So anyway, let's see. How do I get to this? I can't find it right now. So TikTok is paying me because I have like 99,700. No,
It's
yeah,
paying you like
almost
10
100,000 followers. So because of that, TikTok's like, you can earn money. And I think that my total earnings on TikTok so far have been like 18 cents. This is like, wow, I'm gonna go buy myself like one jelly bean for my TikTok earnings. But then again, I think moving this money to my bank will cost me more money than actually it's like 18 cents is.
Totally.
I really feel like this, and it's funny because TikTok is a platform that is like priding itself on paying back to the users. But I'm like, you know, I'd rather not get 18 cents than getting 18 cents because this is ridiculous.
Totally.
So I totally believe, like, I completely agree with that idea that we need to somehow remunerate people for the content they create. So you've been a really good sport in answering my very critical questions. I want to like end this with something that isn't me trying to like make you the person who has to answer for all the things I think are wrong with Web3, which I appreciate you're trying to do, but I'm not trying to pin it on you. So Alexander asked a really important question. How long will the transition take to, in particular, to move from Web 2 to Web3? And what does this challenge look like for IT professionals?
Yeah, so we are seeing like this mass exodus from Web 2 and centralized finance into Web 3. Like so many brilliant minds are kind of coming in to help us solve some of these issues that we've talked about today. Web 3, the Web 3 stack will be solidified in the next 6 to 12 months. And so I think it's very close to, and then once that stack is solidified, it will be ready for mass adoption. Now, I don't really see this like peaceful transition from Web 2 to Web 3. I think Web 2 companies are still like, they're making so much money off like advertisements and SaaS that they're not paying attention to Web 3, but I think they soon will. And you see like Twitter getting involved with NFTs and Facebook rebranding to Meta, and like it's all, I mean, it's a nice nod to Web 3 and like the potential, but it's really not what we're here for. And you're not going to see the cool use cases that Web 3 will bring with these like Web 2 companies adding like centralized JPEGs to their pages and calling them NFTs. And so, yeah, I think we're really close, but we're not quite there yet. But that's why there's so much opportunity now. And I think like if you are in Web 2 or within centralized finance, like try to find a way to start tinkering with the space. But hopefully that leads you to kind of moving over full time and getting involved in a protocol that has like similar values to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the graph.
Right. So where is a good place to start for people?
Yeah, so I think a great place to start is Laura Shin just came out with a new book on Ethereum. You can read that or listen to it on Audible. She used to write for Forbes. She's educated people for many years on the space. There's also like you can read the Book of Satoshi, which is all about Bitcoin and the Bitcoin, like the early days of Bitcoin when Satoshi was still around, who's like an anonymous creator of Bitcoin. And then there's also a ton of podcasts. So there's like Bankless, Unchained, and Blockworks has a great podcast. So I think just get involved, educate yourself, but then the real like potential and like the real opportunity comes when you meet people in the space. So I actually recommend going to events and seeing what people are talking about. And in the blockchain space, there's like so much drama and everyone has their own opinion on every other thing. So just like listen to people, learn from them. And like, I bet at your first event, you'll get like a job offer or at least like someone interested because everyone is hiring in this space. There's like such a lack of talent. So there's so much opportunity. And then you can also just like get involved in the different communities. Like each protocol has like a Telegram and a Discord. And we like within the graph, over 10 people have been hired from the Discord who have like emerged as leaders. So yeah, that's another opportunity as well.
Yeah, again, sounds very much like the open source space of like the early 2000s. We
Yeah.
had bar camps and people would come in and be like, look at this cool project. And then 2 weeks later, it's a company with like 10 people working for them. And then they build some insane thing like Flickr. Just like some random people showed up at a bar camp. It was like, I have this idea for like photo sharing on the internet. We should just build a platform. And then eventually they sold to Yahoo for some
Crazy.
obscene amount of money. And then Yahoo immediately was like, how can we destroy this thing everyone loves as much as possible and make it completely unusable for no good reason? And then they did that. So
Totally. I feel like you can't even use the internet anymore. It's like you have to pay for it. Otherwise, there's like ads everywhere, and it's just it's difficult to use. No longer
As
fun.
someone who builds the internet for a living, I can say that's true. Like the amount of times I'm like sitting there going, "Oh, I want to read this article," but after clicking through 18 different pop-ups. So I have apps on my phone that just immediately just scrape the content off and then just throw away the website, because that's the
wow.
only way to consume the content on the web now. It's so full of ads. And like I told you, right, I have YouTube Premium,
hmm
which is supposed to be that you buy yourself out of ads, right? Somehow there are still ads now. Like they actually
Really
put ads
expensive.
because YouTube will put ads in the video itself. So you can't bypass it. It's part of the video in addition to their overlay videos, right? It's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's
Like I
like
said, it's like the surveillance capitalism aspect is the curse of the internet right now. And I truly hope whatever the next iteration of the web is, it is built in a way that makes surveillance capitalism impossible. Like that has to be, for me, that has to be the baseline. It's like, how do we ensure that this is not possible? And then we'll build a platform that on that basis, like that you cannot just turn people into data cows and then turn that data against the people that are
Totally.
using the platform, right? Because that's the real problem, right? And it's
Absolutely.
funny because like we're both on TikTok exposing ourselves to that hellscape every single day. And it's always shocking to me when I go through, I'm like, God damn, this algorithm got too smart again. So I have to go start liking videos I don't like just to kind of mess it up because it's getting way too specific. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's also crazy to see, like, I think TikTok is like the future of news, as scary as that is. Like, and I think it's the reason that Facebook just had like a completely destroyed quarter because everyone's moving to TikTok. And it's wild because I used to do equity research reports like back when I was interning, and I always thought like Baidu would be the way Google competes with China competes with Google, and like turns out it's TikTok, and turns out they're winning. So yeah, wild.
There's a whole there's so much to talk about around this, but we are out of time. Tegan, thank you very much. This was a super enlightening conversation. The people who are watching are leaving comments. I'll go and try to answer some of them afterwards because they live permanently on the platform.
I will as
And now you can actually interact with them. And people will probably drop in later and watch this again and again. It stays on the platform for as long as I leave it there. I truly appreciate this conversation. I think you've highlighted a lot of the intricacies of the space, and hopefully people who watched it really learned something from it. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at the Kline Venture. I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok. I also my website, tegankline.com. If you want to break into the space, feel free to reach out to me. I do try to like take 15-minute interviews with different people that want to kind of break into the space or need help along their journey. And you can find the graph at thegraph.com and edgeanode at edgeanode.com.
Awesome. I'll try to put a bunch of links in the show notes for this.
Great.
So thank you all very much for watching. And I will be back with more interesting conversations with interesting people in the future.